Welcome everyone tuning in to what is gearing up to be a very exciting webinar. Today we'll be talking dark web investigations, refund and return fraudsters, and APAC e-commerce. I'm Rosalie, I'm the editor for Power Retail and your moderator today. Joining me is Hilla Peled, SVP Data Science at Riskified, to speak on this on a global scale. Welcome. We also have Nick Kirtley. He's the country head for ANZ at Riskified to provide the local perspective. Great to have you guys on. Our agenda today, we will start with a presentation on the policy abuse scenario today. Then we'll dive into the dark web investigation itself and finish on an APAC perspective. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A section, so if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, you can pop them into the questions tab and we'll get to those ones at the end. So let's kick off with a poll question for our audience. So we're asking, how do you think customers find your refund and returns policy? Have some options here: very lenient and super fast, easy to get refunds and returns, fair, the customer needs to wait for our investigation, or strict, we make it very difficult to deter abusers from stealing. So just put your votes in there and we will share the results in a couple of seconds. Very interesting so far. We're getting a bit of a 50-50 with the lenient and fair. We have someone voting for the strict, which is an interesting perspective. All right, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds to get your vote in. Ooh. All right, going to close that one now. So the top winner here is very lenient. Oh, sorry, fair. The customer needs to wait for our investigation. So we'll come back to poll questions in a second. Let me close that, and I'll actually pass on to Hilla to discuss policy abuse. Interesting to hear if you have any insight on that poll we've just done.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So my name is Hilla Peled, as presented SVP Data Science at Riskified, and today I will be discussing what policy abuse is, its magnitude, and how merchants can formulate a strategic response to the rising threat of policy abuse, one that can mitigate risk without compromising on customer experience. Now, before we begin, let's set the stage for our conversation. Policy abuse is where a bad actor behind the scenes takes advantage of merchants' returns, refunds, or promotion policies, so they can get more than they should. During this session, you will learn that it's not always even a person behind the scene. So, what is more challenging these days is that unlike payment fraud, policy abuse exists on a broad spectrum. Everything from casual abuse, where you might occasionally wear things knowing you will return them, all the way to sending back a box of rocks, lying that your package never came, or even hiring a pro service to do all of this for you. So Riskified conducted a global survey on policy abuse recently with some shocking key learnings. On one hand, many merchants rely today on these generous policies, whether it's refunds, returns, promotions, or exclusive offers. They're a key part of how merchants today win and keep customers. At the same time, they're major cost drivers, and I assume from your answers that it's something you feel very often in your own companies. So there's a push and pull of the necessity of providing these policies, and it's customer expectation that that's what they want versus the substantial cost that it incurs. Now allow me to double click on these numbers so we can understand the magnitude of it. So 90% of survey respondents said that their costs from returns abuse were somewhat or very significant. 93% of respondents say that their costs affiliated with item not received abuse were somewhat or very significant. 86 of survey respondents said that their costs from promo code or loyalty program abuse were somewhat or very significant, and 87% of survey respondents say that their costs from reseller abuse were very significant. The category where respondents were most likely to respond that their affiliated costs were very significant was item not received abuse, with 55% of respondents saying costs were very significant. Merchants today feel that they must continue to offer lenient return policies and promotions in order to retain customers and stay competitive. With 93% of respondents said it is somewhat or very important for their organization to offer generous refunds and returns to win new customers and retain loyal ones. And with 90% of respondents said that they're somewhat or very reliant on promotions to retain and remain competitive. Now, the thing is that these policies cost a pretty penny. Actually, a lot more than that. For every dollar in revenue, about a quarter goes to providing these policies. Let these numbers sink in for a second. The average rate of returns for online purchases in 2022 was 20.8%, an increase from 18.1% last year, according to NRF.
Hila, before you continue, your slides aren't updating on the deck, so if you could please. Sorry, we did have some beautiful graphics for you, everyone, but I hope that data was powerful enough to sink in. Anyway, we'll pass these on to you guys after the presentation, of course.
Can you see them now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, apologies for that. So with 20% of refund claims being identified as abusive, numbers reveal an environment that makes these challenges particularly pressing for merchants today. So what is the e-commerce ecosystem that brings us here? Customer experience is key. Brands and retailers tend to give the consumer good experience and want to make sure that they get repeat customers. The cost of acquiring customers is really high. So it is crucial to make sure that we deliver on the promise that we make. Now, we have big box retailers like Amazon and others, and local retailers that set the scene. They also create some sort of environment where customers expect the same experience that they get from these major retailers. So smaller and smaller retailers need to follow and to make sure they provide a seamless experience. And in that case, well, one of the major policies is free returns. It's something that pretty much every shopper expects when they buy online. That's been pretty much standard for the past 10 years or so, free returns. Now, we've seen a trend that has changed indeed where we're reintroducing fee, trying to convert pretty much or absorb the cost of returns, and it's putting back on the customers. The thing is, it's becoming more expensive for them to handle returns with cost of living increases, with labor that has become more scarce, and also with transportation. Cost has become very high recently. So it's more than just the cost of doing business. Now, merchants today really need to make sure that they address the layer of extra cost if they can avoid it. And that is why, probably in recent years, we've seen the equation changes. Even high-profile, large merchants are pulling back policies that once they were famous for, and really their customers appreciated and loved. And to start a rollback and reverse these policies, the overall push and pull here is becoming very real and very relevant for merchants in every size. So where is it all coming from? Merchants have identified refund and policy abuse and first-party misuse as the leading threats, suppressing even phishing. It now ranks as the third most significant issue in markets such as North America, Latam, and Europe. And what is fueling these refunds and returns abuse? Of the top 5 types of fraud, 3 are related to policy abuse: R&R, first-party misuse, and coupon abuse. Now, is the story all about changing customer habits? Probably not. We've seen a steep rise in targeted and sometimes even professional grade abuse across the dark web. There are ongoing discussions not only regarding general abuse MOs, but also tailoring methods to specific merchants. These guides are increasingly even showing up on Google or Reddit, making MOs more accessible than ever. So you really only need one abuser to go through a new friction point for the entire web to be aware of how to overcome it. Now, many take it to the next level with professional refunding services where you simply pay someone to claim refunds on your behalf for a 20% cut of the value. These guides instruct you exactly how to respond when claims get denied, putting pressure on delivery drivers and customer support agents filing a non-refund chargebacks. Understanding the cost of it drives us to start and think, how can we tackle it? But because policy abuse is so difficult to detect, losses from these serial abusers often simply get lumped in with overall refund and return costs. And from my point of view, abuse is becoming the fraud problem that e-commerce faced about 10 years ago. While fraud detection solutions today have matured, the abuse ecosystem is something that the merchant is today left to handle by themselves. I will let now Nick to continue with our policy abuse MOs, how they're being discussed on the dark web, and our dark web investigation for more details. Nick, stage is yours.
Thank you, Hilla. So this is where we switch into a slightly different view on how refund and returns abuse is perpetrated, not just globally, but here in the APAC region as well. So if we click through, let's get into what we see when Riskified looks at the dark web. Looks like we're going to have a poll question number 2. So let's kick this section off with another poll, and then I'll get into that.
Thank you, Nick. Little surprise one in to make sure everyone's paying attention. Don't know why they wouldn't be. Very exciting stuff coming up. This is our second question for our attendees today. This one we're asking, which type of refunds and return scams do you see the most in your business? So we have did not arrive or empty box. We have damaged item, where they've kept the delivery and sent back a faulty. Wrong item, when it wasn't. Empty box returns, which is a refund is paid but a different item is returned. Or wardrobing, which I hear might be one of the most popular ones, which is where you wear an item but then still get it returned. So I'll give everyone about 10 seconds to pop their answers in there. Seeing some interesting results as we go. Seems the did not arrive or empty box when it wasn't is the most popular option here. About 54%. I'll just end the poll in a couple more seconds if everyone gets their votes in. Fantastic. So pretty interesting results here. That did not arrive option is the most popular one amongst our attendees. So I'll close that one and leave you, Nick, to discuss this.
Thanks, Rosalie. So interesting results there. I think item not delivered or package did not arrive is an interesting one. And it ties in perfectly with the first topic here that I wanted to talk a bit about, which is social engineering. So for those that aren't familiar with what social engineering is, social engineering is effectively a tactic that refund abusers use to manipulate customer service teams and others at retailers that review refund claims to put them under pressure to acquiesce and give them the refund. And maybe that refund is not entirely in line with policy, but they're using manipulation tactics. What do I mean by manipulation tactics? I'm talking about uh, carrying on in another way to put it, pretending to be a genuine customer that's very, very upset and is demanding to get their money back and putting a huge amount of emotional pressure on the customer service person. It can be quite effective because a lot of retailers want to keep the customer happy, right? And they want to make sure that that customer has a good experience, does not criticize them in public forums, and wants to just take care of the problem. And there's also a staff well-being factor here, whereby if the customer is, as I said, yelling and screaming, demanding a refund, it's best sometimes for that staff person just to give them the refund to avoid any further unpleasantness. So social engineering is a common tactic. We talked about there in the poll, or showed there in the poll, some of the methods to commit refund and returns abuse, but social engineering is a huge part of it. Once the scam is initiated, there's some form of contact with the customer service team, whether it's via email or phone, and that's where the social engineering can come into it. And we've even seen examples of abusers having certain sounds in the background, such as a crying child, to create extra stress and extra urgency about just taking care of this straight away and getting it done. So something to be aware of there. So policy abuse is definitely more than just one MO. When we look at the dark web, we find all sorts of different entities that are involved. We find there are lone wolves who are offering their services to help commit refund abuse. We've also got very experienced refund abusers literally coaching and teaching beginners on how to commit refund abuse. And one of the things that is very apparent when we search the dark web for refund and returns abuse chatter is this community is very collaborative. They work together, they help each other. All right. And there is a big sense of the big retailers out there have been making millions off us for years and years and years. And it is our right to now go out and do this and abuse them. And that's the mentality that we're dealing with here. It's not necessarily nefarious theft. It's justified theft in their minds, and they collaborate and help each other to perform it. This is a classic example here of somebody that's offering their services, and it appears as though they're very good at taking boxes that are sealed and unsealing them to replace the item inside, replace it with something of a similar weight, and then reseal the box and return it, which is a common tactic, particularly with Apple products. What we see here are examples of other services where you can pay somebody to actually commit the refund abuse on your behalf. And there are also guides on how to do it yourself. You can buy these guides on the dark web. And you can buy specific information about what the refund and returns thresholds are for different retailers, so you stay within those thresholds and get your abusive refund. So lots of resources on the dark web, and that's what we're dealing with as a community to stop. So one of the classic coaching methods and approaches here is to appear to be a legitimate customer, obviously. Now, no retailer pays a refund or grants a refund to somebody that they believe is abusive. When you grant a refund, you believe it's a legitimate instance. Maybe you suspect it could be abusive, but in the vast majority of cases, it looks like a legitimate customer. And abusive parties, they are very good at creating profiles or aliases that look like legitimate customers. Now, it's most certainly not their name. It's most certainly not their personal email address or any of their details, but they'll create an alias. They might do a couple of legitimate transactions that aren't refunded or anything like that for low value transactions. And then they'll attempt the refund scam on the third or the fourth transaction to make it appear as though this is a legitimate customer. And we've even seen cases of individuals with tens of and up to 160 different aliases that they're managing to perform this kind of abuse. So for some people, this is a full-time job, and it's unfortunately one that works in a lot of cases. So if we can step to the next slide. Yeah, so I spoke about social engineering. I think one of the other key call-outs here is that it's an important part of any refund abuse scam. And there's some good examples here of how there is a coaching conversation here happening on the dark web. It's an experienced refund abuser teaching somebody who's less experienced how to get away with it. And they literally talk them through the steps. They say exactly when to do what and which retailers to focus on, and how to manage the process end to end. And they do this for free. They don't necessarily charge money to coach. They help each other for free because, again, they see this as a mission. They see it as them helping each other to get back the money that the retailers have been making off them for years and years. And this slide, when I talk about policy abusers going to great lengths, it always makes me think of the movie Catch Me If You Can with Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio. If you remember that movie, you would remember the lengths that that Leonardo DiCaprio's character goes to falsify the checks. He becomes an absolute expert and really gets very creative and is an incredibly innovative person. And we see the same thing with refund abuse. We see abusers, experienced abusers, becoming very, very clever in the way that they commit refund abuse. So clever, in fact, that they know actually which scams work best with which retailers, because they've tried and failed and tried and failed, and they're perfecting it and getting better and better as they go. So another part of what we see on the dark web is not just coaching, but a specific direction on which scams to attempt with which retailers, because it's worked with that retailer in the past. So that's part of the challenge that we have here again as well. Just to touch on a couple of these methods, I think these are well known based on the poll we just ran, but from a did not arrive perspective, obviously this seems to be a common one here with the audience, and that's what we find as well. When a customer is saying the item didn't arrive, even if you have a signature, even if you have some kind of evidence from the courier that it was in fact delivered, again, abusers will try to use social engineering to manipulate the customer service officer to provide the refund. And it can be a super difficult one because in some cases they're smart enough to threaten that if they don't get the refund, then they'll raise a chargeback. And sometimes the retailers will be scared to have the chargeback raised because they're trying to keep chargebacks under control, and there are fees incurred from their payment processor when a chargeback is raised. And maybe they decide, hey, it's a small or low value item. We're just going to give this person the refund if they push us hard enough. So the did not arrive is a challenging one to deal with. Another one that we see is fake tracking ID. So this is a super interesting one from the perspective of returns, where the customer downloads a label to put on the return, and they put the label on the return, but what they do is they manipulate the address so it doesn't actually go back to the retailer. However, they lodge it with the post, and the tracking ID is recorded, and therefore it looks as though they did try to send it back. And then eventually they'll call in a couple of days' time and they'll say, hey, the tracking ID for this return confirms it's back at your warehouse. I want my refund. The package isn't there because it's been manipulated to go somewhere else, and they kick and scream and yell and demand their refund. So this is just one other type that may or may not relate to your business, but it's definitely one to be aware of if you use return labels. Thanks, Hilla. We'll move to the next slide. So I think that's the end of my section there. I hope that was interesting. I'll pass back to you, Hilla, to take us further.
Thank you so much, Nick. So I think that was extremely helpful and interesting. And at this point, it feels like everything is being abusive, but there are various challenges that contribute to the difficulty of catching this type of abuse. First, we need to understand there are good returns and bad returns. The spike that we've recently seen in abusers this last few years made us understand that it requires more than just specific policies, which, by the way, vary by merchant. Like we mentioned, the definition of abuse tends to vary between the merchants. Now, if we talk about abuse by itself and you try to look at the spectrum, the line is not very clear. Different merchants want to react with different frictions to customers. We also want to have the engagement and recurrent customers not face friction and get insulted by our approach. What's hardest is there's no one truth for whether a customer is an abuser or not, right? Unlike fraud, where you have a chargeback, you can identify whether it was fraudulent or not. That's not the case with abuse. There is a very large variety of behaviors that some will address as legit and some as not. Also, nearly all policies are applied to the individual customer level. So, for example, no more than 3 returns per customer. But what we've seen is that abusers aim to subvert exactly these limitations by creating multiple fake accounts. So just to show you what an abusive behavior can look like, what you see in front of you is a graph of an identity, a one person or a team behind the scenes that in our systems are actually coming through as 172 different accounts. They used 102 different names, 173 phone numbers, 108 different credit cards, 177 card tokens, and 120 IP addresses, all being the same fraudulent or abusive identity behind the screen. So unless merchants can counter abuse tactics like this, they remain rather vulnerable. That's what made us realize that we need to understand what kind of abuse exists and how to tackle that. So basic principle would be leverage as much of the data at our disposal as possible. I'm going to present the way Riskified has decided to approach this problem, but I can assure you that different vendors and merchants address it very similarly, and if not, they should. So, it's like probably any AI solution you can find today, data is being collected throughout the customer journey, from account creation all the way to post-purchase flows, which gives us the best view for identifying first who's behind the screen. And then we want to leverage our 3-layer solution. This 3-layer solution gives us a 360-degree protection experience with 2 different decision points, both in checkout and in claim. What is the 3-layer experience? So the first will be the merchant network. It's connecting all the dots into one story. You have various actors behind the scene who are trying to fake, as Nick described, multiple MOs, and we want to collect that across all our network. Having one merchant suffering from an abusive MO will probably be similar to additional merchants in our network. So what does that look like? Meet MacGyver, for an example. That's a real-time graph representation of orders, accounts, and claims, along with all associated data points. So for MacGyver, I know that its email address is zashu8721@gmail.com with the email address in front of you, phone number, information about the credit card and device. This is just a representation of this specific identity. When moving to identity resolution engine, this is where everything comes into play. It's where we need to identify who is behind the scenes. We will not, by leveraging the entire data set, we want to make sure that we're able to identify the different patterns that exist today and collect them and consolidate them into one identity. So, for an example, what we thought of MacGyver being a first-time buyer, when connecting into the real-time graph, we realized that it's not a first-time buyer. He also had purchase under the name of Barney with email of taco191@gmail.com. And another purchase with bizo343@gmail.com, all connected to be one joint identity behind the screen, although it was tried to be masked by the different patterns. So this is the first part where we leverage AI these days in order to consolidate all the data that we have and to create a picture that allows us to understand at first who's behind the scene. So if we're talking about policies, when you think that you create a policy on an individual, this is where abuse kicks in, and this kind of identity resolution, understanding the identity behind the scenes, allows you to have these policies on these identities specifically. Then we want to come into the risk evaluation engine. The fact that I know who the identity is doesn't mean I know if it's abusive or not. And as we said, there's no a yes or a no decision for abuse. Different merchants will want to apply different policies with a different risk level introduced into these policies. So what a risk evaluation allows us to do is to take all the information that we have, put it into one specific engine or a solution, and allow us to have the trust dial decide on what is the abuse risk we're willing to take. By doing so, we understand one, who's the identity behind the screen, and two, to decide on how much risk we're willing to take with that identity based on as past history, past behavior, similar identities, all the data that we have from this specific claim, previous claims and patterns, and other merchants' behavior as well. All of that consolidated into our risk evaluation engine. That's it from my end, Nick.
Right, thanks, Hilla. That's wonderful. I thought a couple of other questions that do tend to come up on the spot might be interesting. So sorry to throw these at you without prior notice, but I think one of the things that tends to come up is when a retailer moves to adopt an AI-powered refund or return review claim, what do they stop doing? Do they stop doing all of the checks that they're doing today, or do they use the AI check to augment and enhance the checks that they're doing to try to make better decisions?
So it's a great question because my answer will be that just like any AI application in the world today, people tend to at first be nervous of letting go of control. So that means that it really depends on how mature the merchant is with AI solutions. It can vary in between reviewing manually many of our decisions or recommendations, building that trust, and only then letting go in a way of letting the engine to make the decisions, to merchants who are very tech savvy, understand that by building AI engine, we have our own kind of safety measures behind the scenes. Everything is being controlled, and allow the machine to make most of the decisions while monitoring that from day one. So it's really a matter of how confident the merchant is, how much experience he has with past AI solutions, but it all at the end boils down into understanding that the machine allows us to do things that the manual work could not do. So it's not about replacing the people, it's enhancing the work of the manual review that was done into something that is more programmatic and allows us to reduce risk and increase profit. And once merchants understand that while working with us, it changes the equations completely.
Got it. Got it. So it sounds like it's very much a use alongside the existing processes, but and don't lose that human eye, at least in the beginning. Cool.
Correct.
I'm going to ask two more questions, and as I do that, if anyone else that's listening in would like to ask a question, please drop a question into the chat, and we'll be happy to try to get to that. But my next question is, and this is another one that comes up sometimes, is what do you see, Hilla, from the perspective of relationship between refunds and chargebacks? And what I mean by that is, once a retailer starts to deny more refunds that are abusive, do they then see any changes in the chargeback rate as a result of denying those refund claims?
It's a great question because unlike fraud, where the relation is very straightforward, with abuse, the changing MO and the changing MOs are also deviating towards the chargebacks. So that means we definitely do not see increase in chargebacks when we start working with new merchants. What we do see is the abusers behind the scenes trying different MOs. They don't go all the way to the bank filing chargebacks because they don't have what is needed to actually prove their claims. But we do see some fluctuation with the patterns, meaning we can have one pattern more significant, and the more we block that loophole, they're trying a different one. We do see some changes, but that also fluctuates with seasonality. We do see some changes in chargebacks, but they're not correlated to the different claims approaches we have. That is not the case.
Got it. And I guess one of the other things that's interesting that we've seen here locally is that while the value of refund abuse might be relatively high and an eye-opening figure, the actual number of individuals that are perpetrating that abuse, it's a very, very small number of people. So if you look at it from the number of claims, of refund claims that are denied, it might be, say, 3% of all refund claims, but it's not 3% of customers. It's a very small percentage there, which might be why there isn't an uptick in chargebacks as well. Also, I think that, from what we've seen is those serial abusers that are running, 10 accounts, 20 accounts, over 100 different accounts. They're trying to conceal their identity. They don't want anyone, especially the banks, to know who they are. So once you obviously raise a chargeback, you're having to use a real card and having to divulge yourself and reveal yourself to some extent. So I think that might play a part here in ANZ as well. I guess the other question I was interested to touch on is, we've talked a lot about refund abuse today, but there's another side to this, which is, the returns abuse. So someone might be, say, buying something to wear an outfit to an event, they keep the tag on and they return it. Or it might be that they're buying something and claiming that they want to return, but the return logistics and the handling really doesn't make it worthwhile, especially if this person's doing it again and again and they're a very unprofitable customer. So my question is, I guess, how do retailers, two-part question, how do retailers use this kind of technology to identify returns abusers? And then once they identify the returns abusers, how do they actually manage that?
So I think you touched a very important point. We don't have just one use case when talking about policy abuse. It can also be early refunds, can be early returns, meaning merchants today have different friction points. So if we want to decide that some of our customers actually can have an early return and money being sent back because this customer seemed to be safer to us. We can have a
Mhm.
different approach to different users' behavior. So the way that it's being done today is that merchants identify these use cases, they approach it differently, they decide on different thresholds and how they want to address these customers. Once you identify the customer and you can predict and understand the behavior and the patterns that it introduces, you can decide where you want to put that dial of trust and how much you want to allow versus the risk you want to take. So it's not just a refund use case. It's really a matter of the different patterns of behavior that AI today allows us to understand, that allows us to know that behind the screen there is a team, there is a bot, there is a person, how many accounts it created, and that ability allows us to really have a different approach and behavior for each and every individual identified,
Mm.
whether it's a refund or a return.
I think that's a super important point in terms of not dealing with this issue with blanket rules across all customers, but dealing with cases of abuse in a different way to the way you deal with a legitimate customer, and tailoring the checks and balances that are in place. I think another interesting concern that does come up here, especially in the ANZ region, are that there are laws around that dictate when a refund must be given to the customer. And there are some concerns sometimes around saying no to a refund claim and running foul of those laws. And I guess my perspective on that is two things. One is, again, these people are trying, the serial abusers who are the worst of the worst, blatantly just after financial theft here, they don't want their identity to be revealed. So I think it would be unlikely that they would seek to take legal action. But if there is concerns about saying no to a refund claim, I think another cool option here is the ability to block the identity at the checkout from being able to purchase in the first place. Because once they get into your ecosystem, they're just going to start to generate costs. So keen to get, and maybe this is our last question for the webinar, is keen to get your take, Hilla, on that checkout blocking approach versus saying no to the claim and how that works.
Yeah, so every merchant will tell you and tell us that blocking a customer at checkout is something that you want to have high confidence in
Mm.
its likelihood to be abusive, versus a claim where you can have another cycle, another chance to review that claim if that customer decides to call your customer service. But with that said, if you think of the amount of data you have today available, and just like these fraudsters and abusers are using AI to abuse the system, we can leverage what we have in order to identify them. There are um, significant indications for these abusers to be coming back and moving from one merchant to another, allowing us to identify them and block them across the network is a very strong tool. And as you mentioned, it's a very limited number of fraudsters and people who create a large amount of claims and damage. So at the end of the day, it is all about identifying them at the right time, and blocking them at checkout is really saving a lot of money for the merchant, not just for refund, but as you mentioned, also for return. The costs of doing good and having that return shipped back sometimes is more expensive than actually giving that refund um, at the moment of ask. Um, so it's really a matter of evolution. And I think that the policy abuse world is getting more and more matured to being able to identify that at checkout and not just at the filing of a claim.
Well, thank you so much. That's actually brought us to the end of our time today. Hilla and Nick, that was awesome. I'm sure you've covered absolutely everything there. But if the audience do have any questions, just email them to Power Retail and we'll pass them on to our lovely panelists. Thanks so much for attending, everyone. Thank you again to our lovely panelists. It was a really awesome discussion. I certainly got a lot out of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalie. Thanks, everyone.